So the first speaker is Tim Kong from Aotearoa, or New Zealand, and he has connections to Fiji and China through his father, and Scotland and Ireland through his mother. His degrees in political science and work experience includes time spent in corporate technical production, 5 years touring with British bands, a decade as primary school teacher in New Zealand. He joined the National Library in 2020 to lead the Pacific Virtual Museums project, and he was appointed as the Director of Digital Experience in January 2022. So Tim will be presenting what is cultural heritage from the digitized perspective, especially from those institutional perspectives that challenge Western-based galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. So these institutions do valuable work, but value and enable access in the default mediums of the West. So what he's bringing up to the table is these Pacific-based communities and institutions that are not often able to replicate these models. So how do we enable these kind of approaches? So this talk will share the thinking behind the design, development, and functionality of the site Digital Pacific. We will invite participants to consider how records of their institutions could be shared in the Pacific and how to make these records accessible to people of the Pacific. So Tim, thank you very much for joining us. And whenever you're ready, please, you can start sharing your screen.
Joyce, thank you very much, Javier. Yeah, thank you to all the organisers at TaNC for inviting me along. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Nabukulevu te monga, to Dikinakelo te awa, ko Ngāti Whiti te iwi, ko Tim toku ingoa. I just wanted to acknowledge my mountain, which is Nabukulevu in Fiji, my stream, my water, which is the stream Dikinakelo, also in Fiji, my iwi, my tribe, the island of Fiji, the land of Fiji, and to introduce myself as Tim. As said in the introduction, I am the Director of Digital Experience at the Puna Mātauranga o Aotearoa. I've just realized I need to do the sharing of the screen. That would be helpful. And to take you through, here in Te Whanganui Tara, or Wellington, at the National Library in New Zealand. I'm speaking today as Director of the National Library, but also on behalf of my colleagues Tapatukura Raya, Ulu Afisi, and Matarini Narini, who are the actual Pacific Virtual Museum team. They are the team that are looking after this incredible project now. So I speak on behalf of them, but also from my perspective as someone who led that project for 2 years. So Digital Pacific, and there's the URL on the screen there. I always just say, if you want to just look at the website while I'm talking, you're more than welcome to do that. But Digital Pacific is implemented by the National Library of New Zealand in collaboration with the National Library of Australia and funded by the Australian government, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It has one sole purpose, and that is, as Javier said, to make visible and accessible the digitized cultural heritage of the Pacific for people in the Pacific and of the Pacific. There's a couple of things it's not that are useful, I think, to understand straight away relative to the worlds you work in. It's not a repository. We don't hold any content. Secondly, we don't do any digitization, and so that's not part of our scope. And I guess thirdly, and most importantly, whilst we are built for these two institutions, or with these two institutions, we aim to make the most impact in the Pacific. So that comes with a lot of different pressures than maybe building infrastructure or a site and service for your own institution. I suppose the easiest way to think about it in a sort of like for like would be the Trove model in Australia, or Europeana in the European space, or DPLA in the US. I want to start with a little story, as good presentations do. You start with a story. This is, if you follow the link, and I'm happy to share the slides after the people, this is a link to a video called The Suva of Yesteryear that ABC Australia shot, we think, in about the early 1960s. It was held in the ABC archives until about 2020, 21, when it was digitized in part as the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's contribution to Digital Pacific. About 100 pieces of audio and video were digitized, hosted on their site, and then made accessible through Digital Pacific, which I was leading at the time. It was shared on Facebook by ABC. This was the first launch video. And I sent it through to my father, and he said, on Facebook, I said, Dad, look at this, there's some incredible footage of Fiji, and he'd lived in Suva in the 1960s. And he sent me a simple message back on WhatsApp, which was, do you know what that boat is? And I said, no. And I said, that's the Kandavu Levu. Now, at that moment, sort of a whole bunch of things turned in my head in incredible ways, because the Kandavu Levu is a key part of my father's history and my family's history. It was a ship that traveled between the islands in Fiji. It sank in 1964 and still is Fiji's single greatest maritime disaster. My two uncles were the owners of that vessel and passed away in that tragedy. My father was on that boat, and as he tells the stories, he wanted to sail on that day. And one of the crew said, oh, you'll have to ask your brothers. And my father was scared of his older brother, so he jumped off the boat. And what I love about this story is I have never seen any video footage of the Kandavu Levu until 2023, when a project that I was leading to make visible digitized cultural heritage of the Pacific did that. But it did that because an institution, in this case ABC, had set to make their content visible and accessible, and because they preserved that content for over 50 years. And I think there's something really powerful in that story, because actually the records that you hold and you preserve and you care for do hold stories. But mostly Pacific people don't know, A, that you exist in your institutions, B, that you hold records of the Pacific, and C, how to get to them if they knew that you existed and you knew that you held the records, because of how we design access. And so I think as I go forward here, I wanted to talk about what Digital Pacific set out to do. We were launched in March of 2020. If you remember, that was quite an auspicious time around the world. Our entire project was designed remotely, and the website, as you see it, was designed in about 20 weeks, from a blank page, as you see on the right of your screen here, through to the site that was launched in November 2020. We did it in a very Pacific way. We wanted to lean into connections and relationships, and we did it, as you can see on the screen here, with people from the North Pacific, from Fiji, from Samoa, from a whole range of Pacific Island nations. Not every single one, and I will admit too that in terms of the privilege of design, the people that were able to join us were the people who had stable network connections, and that is not a reality in the Pacific. It was designed within a number of ways, and really specifically designed for this story here, this narrative here. We designed for places where network access is slow or expensive. We designed for 2G and 3G environments, which I know probably in Europe and the UK are unheard of in this day and age. We designed intentionally for mobile devices first, not for laptops, not for tablets. We designed for mobile phones, and not the latest and greatest iPhone either. We designed for places where, like I say, data can be expensive as well as slow. And as the case in this story, you might only have it for little pieces. I was quite specific with that. We set the designers and developers a challenge so that no single page on the website is more than 800 kilobytes in size. And we lent into leveraging metadata only and thumbnails only. So we work quite hard to stay within that range, because that makes it accessible in a purely physical way. The second thing we tried to do is to present. I remember saying to the designers, I want people when they land on this page to see some of themselves in it, to see some of the Pacific in it. So some of the visual elements, and this is just a screen grab, not the actual site, some of the screen elements you can explore it, all represent elements of the Pacific. And even that was quite interesting as we went through the design, because the initial designs were very, if I can be honest, very Moana, very Disney-like. And a number of our colleagues from Melanesia and Micronesia said, well, there's millions of people in PNG who've never seen a beach, who've never been to the coast. because of how mountainous PNG is, for example, in the Solomons. And so some of this, we brought more mountains in, we brought more color palettes that represent earth and clay rather than just, you know, ocean reefs and the postcard views that we might have of the Pacific. The other thing we wanted to do was we wanted to recognize that these island regions, these geographical regions, are mostly invisible to us in the West because they are very, very small. And yet they are beautiful places in and of themselves. So if you use the interface that is the top edge of it is there and you hover over each of those geographical locations, you get a silhouette drawn of those islands or those groups of islands. And you start to get a sense of the scale of those islands because they are drawn to scale. So I'd invite you to explore that. But I guess the second thing here in terms of making visible, we designed for the network. And secondly, we designed for representing Pacific people back to themselves in the interface that they were landing on. The third thing we designed for was to try and reduce complexity in metadata. We have all of the metadata in our API when we ingest metadata from content partners, but we don't present it all. And we try to simplify it. So as you see here on the bottom left corner, and this is a little bit out of date, apologies for the numbers, but we just said have a button called text, and anything tagged as text in the source providers, we would present if you click this option. And one of the librarians said to us, when you say text, do you mean published text, unpublished text, journals, and so on? And I, rather naively, I'd only been at the library about 6 months at the time. I said, I'm not too sure, but would anything with words count in this section? And we wanted to, you know, I think that was validated. And I say this honestly, that wasn't to disrespect the absolute value there is in categorizing and making sense of things in metadata. But it was validated as an approach. And one of our user testers said, I like how your site makes it simple. My Nana could use this. But because she can speak English, but she can't read English. And I think often in a world where you're designing for a written format, which is very much the Western world, you forget that there are people who might be able to speak it, but not read it. So we designed in the front end to reduce complexity. The second thing we wanted to do was to make the thumbnails of records the heroes. And I use this example from Alexander Turnbull, which is part of the National Library of New Zealand of Tui Levuka. And again, if you haven't explored the site, some of the ways of quickly and simply navigating through metadata. This is what you would, if you find Tui Levuka and we do some of the filtering, this is what it looks like. There's not at the time when I took the screenshot, there wasn't a lot of other metadata, but it sits there as a record. We talk about we want to be no more than 3 clicks from source. So this is 1 click to get to here. I now click again. I now get a bit more data about him. And again, this is just on Digital Pacific, so this is 2. And now I actually want to view it at the Alexander Turnbull Library. And I click the 3rd one. And I like to show that transition because, like we say, no more than 3 clicks from source, because without Digital Pacific, this is the starting point for finding these records. And I think to my first point, where you have people who might be able to speak English but don't read English, this is confusing as an interface. I'd also suggest, and I can't actually see the thumbnail because it's under the Zoom strip here, but I think there's something fascinating when, you know, we know the great-great-granddaughter of this person, and she found this image via the site. And if this was her starting point, what we make a hero of with our standard interface is all of the ways that we in the West describe this record. But if you're the great-great-granddaughter of this chief, why isn't his picture and his face the hero of this? We diminish the people of which we're capturing this metadata in some ways in our interfaces. And, you know, I appreciate there's lots of work to do around UX and how you push and pull it. But what I would suggest here is that you can do both. You can have ways into your preservation collections that make heroes of the things that probably matter to the hearts of most who are discovering this content for the first time. I'd also like to say, whilst we are metadata only, one of the things we don't do is we don't translate any of that metadata for the benefit of an English-speaking audience or where we've designed. That was really important to us because we wanted to support Pacific communities to create metadata in their own languages. And some of Dr. Teresi, who's been a fantastic supporter of the project. She said, but I do all of my, she uses YouTube as essentially her platform and her recordings. She says all of my metadata, all of my, what I fill in on the YouTube fields is all Bao and Fijian, the main dialect. And she said, is that okay? And I said, absolutely. I don't speak Fijian, even though I'm Fijian, but it's not for me. Your audience is Fiji. So you don't have to translate for us just because we are an English-based provider, if you will. And in the same way, in the example on the right here, this is a record from the Australian National University Library, but as you can see, written the text in German as the title for Samoa. So we don't do any translation of that for the benefit of a user base. We want to enable the languages of the Pacific. One of the other things we did in terms of access is we also spoke to what we call a user contribution function. And this is a function where on a record, and if you use the site, you can see it, you can share your own story, your own memory, or maybe just a reflection. Some of them are very simple, some of them are very detailed. I think there's an incredible thing here because what it does in creating this user contribution, it's not crowdsourcing. It's not trying to add metadata. We're really clear that this is just someone's reflections of the record or what it makes them remember or feel. And we did that really clearly, and we changed our terms and conditions to reflect this because we were also very clear that we didn't want these words. We wanted to acknowledge that these words, thoughts, memories are of the people who share them with us. And it's a privilege for us for them to share them with us, for us to hold them. So our legal terms and conditions on the site say this. And I'd like you to focus on the second line for this next part. No party may use these contributions without the permission of the user. It was really important to us that we don't claim any ownership of them. They remain fully the words and knowledge of the people who contribute. That was really, really important to us because this is the kind of contribution that can come through. So this is a contribution about a record, which says, actually, this is the photo of this person, this mama, this is her name, and she's in the process of doing this. And it says, please note, there are no pandanus anywhere in this photo. This was from 2022. This is the record of that item that she was referring to, the contributor was referring to. What you notice here, or maybe don't notice, I notice because I can see both sides, is this original source record has been updated with that user contribution with no attribution. And why I call this the metadata of failure is because at this institution, which now has taken this person's metadata, their contribution, it is now theirs because it is on their institutional site bound by their terms and conditions. In 2050, when we look back at this, or in 23, right now when you look at it, you have no record that this institution had the wrong metadata for over a decade or 20 or 30, 40 years. And I think there's something really powerful to consider if we are designing for crowdsourcing or designing for user contributions. We cannot colonize people's contributions as we colonize their records and their artifacts. And it's so easy online to do that. And so I'd leave that to you as a challenge. How do you hold the metadata of failure? How do you make sure you don't take people's knowledge and just claim it as your own? I'm conscious of my time, so I'll try and speed up here. I took this from the TaNC website. This is a research project that breaks down the barriers that exist between the UK's outstanding cultural heritage collections with the aim of opening them up to new research opportunities, encouraging the public to explore them in new ways. And I wanted to wrap up or head towards the wrap up quite quickly and leave you with some questions that speak to this based on my experience of designing for the Pacific. One is, how will you frame progress? We had a very simple elevator pitch, which was to make visible and accessible. We didn't seek to do any more than that. And we also we sought to ensure the metaphor we used at our site was a bridge between worlds, the worlds of museums, galleries, libraries, and archives, and the worlds of Pacific people who, as I said right at the start, don't know you exist. We've sought to be a bridge between those worlds. And in the design, I hope you've seen that the point of a bridge is that you get across it. And I love that a bridge can be beautiful, but the point is to get across it. We've designed our site to be beautiful, but to get people in the Pacific as quickly as possible to source. And that for us is always our measure. Have we done that? So I think be really clear as you go through how you frame progress. Keep your scope tight and deliver on it well. It doesn't have to be everything at once, but step through it. Secondly, and I gave an example of metadata there, I think in our institutions and our cultures, we hold up our cultural heritage institutions as temples of truth. And I would suggest that with metadata, and the metadata represents that truth, I would suggest that metadata mostly represents a reality that's captured by acquisitions and descriptions people at a point in time. And even with the best of work and the best of provenance, curators are only working with a reality. Truths are multiple in the Pacific world. And as in that example I gave, what happens when someone else's truth or someone else's reality now is taken as institutions? We have to be very careful. Again, does it represent metadata? Does metadata represent a truth? Does it represent our reality? Or why can't we have both? I remain fascinated by how often in our databases, you can only have one location. Nabucalevu, which I gave a name at the end, is at the start of in my mihi, it's the name of the mountain in my father's village. It's also known as Mount Washington. I'm not quite sure why. I guess an American sailed past at some point. And so on many maps, it's known as Mount Washington, but the locals have always known it as Nabucalevu. Most databases only have one. Why can't we have both? Lastly, I think as you look at your work and as you look at the spaces you are curating and preserving, I challenge you to ask these questions. What are we preserving? What are we handing down digitally, culturally? I remain fascinated at the number of items and institutions that are held up as, Pacific culture, that their culture in the Pacific only comes from the use of them. But the way our institutions hold them, we're never allowed to use them. And the National Library of New Zealand holds Robert Louis Stevenson's Tanoa Bowl. Tanoa Bowl is the bowl you make kava in. When I was first visited, I was shown this bowl, and I said, quite honestly, could we make kava in it? And the curators almost just had heart attacks, I think, because why would you put water on this incredible preserved object? And I was reflecting on, I get that, but you're not preserving it for anything. In a Pacific way, if you don't use it to make kava, it's just a piece of wood. Why are you preserving it? Why are you leaving it on a shelf? Because I think this is an incredible challenge. The problem of each of our generations is how we maximize the transmission of the good stuff and minimize the passing down of the bad stuff. That is a daily challenge, I think, for us in our institutions, and how we reflect that in our work, in what we do, and how we collect and curate. And lastly, I'd leave you with this, because there is an incredible power and privilege in the work you do, in the institutions that you sit in. And you will be challenged. The more you make these visible and accessible, and the more you ask the public to engage. They will sometimes be simple questions. Why do you even have this stuff? Why can't I have my stuff back? Those are real simple level ones. I would implore you to be okay with sitting in this fire, but never let it become you. There is a space that you walk in that matters to the preservation of history and heritage, and the decisions you make in that fire will enable people far into the future. So be okay. I'll close with this slide. It is the Pacific Ocean. It is the blue continent. I love this slide because it's not a view of the world we see very often. The Pacific Ocean covers 33% of the surface area of the planet. Every single other continent could fit inside this expanse you see here. And it's mostly invisible to us. Across this ocean, 27 nation states, hundreds of cultures, dozens of languages, hundreds of languages, millions of people. And our project, and I'll close with my colleague Opeta Alafaio's line. He said to us when we built and developed this site, he said, it's an incredible thing that you have done, that we have done to make visible accessible, because he said Pacific people know what colonialism, it's one thing for Pacific people to know what colonialism took from them. It's another thing entirely, and we know what that is, it all left, it was taken. It's another thing for them entirely to not know that their culture sits in storage far, far away. And again, as to being okay with sitting in the fire, that is an incredible privilege. So as I finish, I'd say to each of you, be brave, be bold in your places. Be open to being in a relationship with Pacific people who don't know your worlds, but who come with heart and passion and care. Be open to relationships and conversations, and hold that weight and responsibility lightly and gently, and go well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Very interesting. So again, keep in mind that we have the questions at the end. So next we have Eero Hyvönen from University of Palo Alto and University of Aalto University and University of Helsinki. So this presentation will present a model and lessons learned for creating a cross-domain national ontology and linked open data infrastructure in Finland. The idea is to extend the global domain. Oh, sorry, just pop up my screen. The idea is to extend the global domain agnostic layer cake, the semantic web layer cake with domain-specific and local features needed in applications. Eero is going to present a pre-recorded session, and after we finish, we'll come back and we'll have the Q&A. So Eero, whenever you're ready, please feel free to start.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me, and I hope you can hear me. And now we're moving from New Zealand, actually more or less precisely on the other side of the globe to Finland, to north. I'm very interested in presenting our work in this webinar, because in 20 years ago we actually published Museum Finland, Finnish museums on the semantic where the idea was exactly what I think you are now also working on, publishing museum collections in a kind of global way, integrating them to each other so that you can have an access to basically all museums from one sort of access point. The presentation that I will be giving it's already recorded and it's available in YouTube, and I will share in the chat the link if you would like to see it. And also there will be a link of the slides, because this presentation has been created by using slides, and from the slides you can have the links, for example, to the different systems and papers mentioned in the presentation. So let's start. This talk presents experiences in Finland on creating a national cross-domain ontology and linked data infrastructure for digital humanities and using it on the semantic web. I am Eero Hyvönen from Aalto University and University of Helsinki, Helsinki Center for Digital Humanities. First, a few motivating words about the semantic web and linked open data. After that, I will discuss how to build a national linked open data infrastructure and use it in applications. We chose to use linked open data as the technical basis for our work. There are several reasons for this. By using linked data, everybody's data can be collaboratively enriched by each other's data instead of publishing data in separate data silos. Everybody wins by collaboration. By using linked data, it's possible to create findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable data using the FAIR principles. This means that the value of the data increases. Finally, creating more intelligent applications for the public, curators and researchers is possible. When the machine understands the data, it's possible and more cost efficient to create intelligent applications. Leonardo da Vinci has said, "Learn how to see. Realize that everything connects to everything else." This wisdom is very true regarding both national and pan-European cultural heritage contents and the planned European collaborative cloud for cultural heritage. However, cultural content linkedness gives us two major problems to tackle. The first key problem is that cultural heritage contents are richly interlinked, not only on a national scale, but across the borders of European countries and beyond. We all share common history and cultural background. For example, a book or epic may be the source of inspiration for a symphony, a painting, and is related to biographies of people, cultural sites, objects in museums, and so on. The cultural content includes texts, speeches, images, 2D and 3D models, movies and animations represented in incompatible formats using different national data models and using different natural languages. The second key problem is that cultural heritage content creation is distributed in different kinds of organizations, including not only memory organizations, but also media companies, land survey organizations, communities producing data such as Wikipedias, as linked data clouds, and different citizens participating in citizen science initiatives. When independent parties create content independently from each other, the result is an avalanche of data silos that do not speak with each other. A painful lesson learned in creating pan-European services such as Aotearoa is that it is very difficult to make the data silos interoperable and reusable. A solution model to address the two previous key problems is depicted in this figure. The idea is to establish a shared data and ontology infrastructure based on linked data. When a content provider creates a piece of content using the shared infrastructure, the data is automatically interlinked and enriched by the other data provider's data, and their data by the new piece of content. In this model, everybody can win, both content providers and the end users, by getting access to the enriched interlinked data. The European Cultural Heritage Cloud could be a platform for fostering this work. Albert Einstein has said, "Intellectuals solve problems, but geniuses prevent them." This wisdom applies very well to infrastructure building. The most important elements of a national ontology infrastructure for digital humanities are various domain ontologies, shared metadata models, and ontology and linked data services online. As for ontologies and ontology services, we created the Koko Ontology Cloud and Onkifi service that was established in 2008. In 2014, the National Library deployed the Onki service as a national service in Finland. For publishing datasets and data models, we created the Link Data Finland platform. This system generalizes Tim Berners-Lee 5-star model of publishing linked data. You get the 6th star if you provide your data with a schema and documentation so that people can understand and reuse your data easily. You get 7th star if you validate your data and denote its provenance so that people can trust the quality of your data. Some experiences and lessons learned in creating national data services. The Link Data Finland platform makes it very easy to publish data. The services are generated automatically from a service description metadata description. Reusing services and support functions is very cost efficient, I think, because unnecessary re-implementations can be avoided in this way. The platform turned out to be very useful also for building human infrastructure. We have used it in hackathons, in educational university courses, for example. The basic services in a system like Link Data Finland can be run with little maintenance. However, technical expertise is of course needed there on semantic web technologies. A system like Link Data Finland must be sustainable. It is now part of National Research Infrastructure Roadmap of the Academy of Finland, so this is a kind of first step forward. And we are lucky that the servers are provided for free for universities by the CSC company owned by the Ministry of Education and Culture. An issue that is still a challenge is how to keep the data and services up to date. For example, when the data changes somewhere or an ontology changes somewhere, how is that change propagated to all other services and datasets that use that data? How to use the infrastructure for applications, Sampo model and Sampo series of systems.
Science is vast, and so is the concept of AI. Though based on mathematical thinking, AI also has a lot to offer to social sciences through multidisciplinary approaches. For example, gathering of information. Very often, search engines give irrelevant or uninteresting results, or they can be out of context. The computer cannot comprehend what particular documents on the web are about. To provide more intelligent access for information, scientists have created the semantic web, where contents on the web are made comprehensible to the computer.
Another major benefit of the semantic web is that it can aggregate data from different data sources, even across language barriers. So we can get more data into the systems and in an interoperable way, so that people can be served with not only more intelligently the data, but also more data.
A worldwide pioneering semantic web concept has been developed in cooperation with the University of Helsinki and the Aalto University. It is a series of 12 semantic portals, each dedicated to a certain context. For example, the biography Sampo is a collection of over 13,000 biographies held by the Finnish Literature Society. These were transformed into a linked data service and enriched by linking it to the data of 16 external sources, such as Wikipedia, libraries, museums, and other archive collections. If you click on a particular biographical subject, you get a lot of interlinked, rich content about them. You can compare their lifeline on an interactive map, or you can select different life events from a list composed from different biography sources.
We have integrated the search and exploration systems with data analytic tools. So you not only get the possibility of search and explore the data, but also do data analysis and find interesting patterns of knowledge in the data.
For example, you can compare the places of birth and death of generals and clergymen in Finland in the 19th century and find out that generals moved a lot more than the clergy, who tended to remain in one place.
We're using artificial intelligence for solving problems. So not only do we provide the user with the tools for solving the problems, but we can provide him with artificial intelligence that can solve the problems by itself. During the last 17 years, we have published quite a few Sampos, semantic portals, and data services on the web. They represent a wide variety of different application domains. For example, Museum Finland and Culture Sampo are about museum collections and Finnish culture, Book Sampo about fiction literature, War Sampo and War Victim Sampo about war history. There are lots of systems dealing with biographical information like Biography Sampo, US Congress Prosocover, and mapping manuscript migrations about manuscripts. Find Sampo is about archaeological finds, Letter Sampo about epistolary data, Law Sampo about legislation, and Parliament Sampo about parliamentary speeches and networks of politicians. As a practical example of using a Sampo portal and a linked open data service, I will show a video about Letter Sampo, historical letters on the semantic web.
This video introduces the Letter Sampo project at the Aalto University and Helsinki Center for Digital Humanities Helsinki. We are developing a framework and a demonstrator for publishing and analyzing historical epistolary data in digital humanities based on semantic web technologies. This new project in Finland was inspired by our earlier collaborations with the Pan-European EU Cost Action Reassembling the Republic of Letters and the University of Oxford, related to historical letters sent from the 16th to 19th century in Europe and beyond. Letters are always sent from a place to another and are therefore scattered in different archives in different countries, written in different languages, harmonizing the metadata from separate data silos and aggregating the data into a semantically interoperable global service for digital humanities analyses makes a nice use case for the Sampo model and Sampo UI framework, developed at the Semantic Computing Research Group. The Sampo model includes a collaborative business model for collaborative data publishing in a shared linked data service, the idea of accessing the data from multiple perspectives, the idea of integrating the service seamlessly with data analytic tools for research, and finally, a model for addressing research questions in 2 steps, where faceted search is first used for filtering out data of interest, and data analysis and visualizations are then applied to it. We next illustrate this idea by showing examples on analyzing letter data by using the letter Sampo demonstrator. This is the main entry page for the letter Sampo user interface. The application consists of 3 perspectives to the underlying data: the actors, the letters, and the places. The underlying dataset in this example contains information about a total of 34,000 actors. By actor we mean an individual person or group of people like universities or religious organizations. In the faceted search we can filter or search specific actors by their name, gender, or times of birth or death, or groups of actors for prosopographical research. For example, we can search for the mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. On the result page we will see him among the other matches. The result table shows his years of birth and death, and the amount of the letters involved, based on the underlying metadata. On the person landing page we will have even more information about him and his correspondences. In addition to showing his basic biographical information, the page contains fields for his alternative names and vocations. There is a list of all the other actors with whom he has been in contact. It should be emphasized that any visualization or data analysis in a system like Letter Sampo is an analysis of the underlying dataset, not of the real world. Any conclusions drawn from the analysis need source criticism and understanding the limitations of the data. For example, in this example there are 149 letters of Leibniz and the data misses lots of letters. Leibniz was a very active writer with some 15,000 letters and 1,100 correspondence, so in this case only 1% of those are available in the demonstrational dataset. In spite of this, analyzing an incomplete letter collection by distant reading can give novel insights to the researcher and collection manager, and suggest topics of interest for further close reading. The first person on the list is Christian Huygens, with whom he has sent 70 letters. As far as the data can tell us in this case, there are also detailed lists of all letters sent or received by him. The last result on this page shows a list of places he has been active and based on data about sending or receiving letters. The next tab, Network of Letters, shows a visualization of actors' egocentric network. The link width between 2 actors indicates the amount of mutual correspondence. The wider the link, the more letters has been sent between the 2 actors. We can for instance spot that Leibniz sent 39 letters to Christian Huygens, while Henry Oldenburg sent more than 200 letters to Huygens. Again, this analysis is based on data about only a fraction of Leibniz known letters. The next tab illustrates the number of letters on a timeline, where we can observe that the data is based on letters from 2 periods, the first one in the 1670s, and the second in the 1690s. This could indicate the collection manager that letters in between may be missing. The letter perspective page has a similar faceted search application as the actor page. Here we can browse and filter the data of 162,000 letters by their sender, receiver, date, language, subject, or data source. The second tab on the letter page visualizes the letter routes on a map application. Currently we are viewing the routes of letters sent from Paris. The third tab on the letter page demonstrates the amount of correspondences on a timeline. From this curve can be seen that the data is distributed from 16th to 19th century, with the majority of letters in the 17th century. In addition to the ready-to-use data views in Letter Sampo, the underlying Sparkle endpoint can be used easily for further data analyses using, for example, Python scripting in Google Columns. This data table shows the most active mathematicians in the data set, filtered out from the data. The left column shows the actors ranked by the number of letters sent. In the middle column ranking is based by the number of received letters, and on the right by the total amount of letters. The blue text color indicates that the actor has written more letters than what he has received. This is a visualization of the top writers between the years 1620 and 1770, and the ranking of the author is depicted on the y-axis, so that the highest ranking actor appears on the top of the diagram. Based on the underlying collection data, in the 1620s and 1630s Marin Mersenne was at the highest rank, Christian Huygens was among the top writers during the years 1650 to 1690s. Isaac Newton has been an active writer in the late 17th and early 18th century. And finally we have Leonard Euler, who's been the top writer during 4 decades from 1730s to 1760s. Thank you all for watching this video. More information about the Letter Sampo project is available at the webpage of the Semantic Computing Research Group.
Summary, lessons learned. This timeline summarizes our work on building and applying the national semantic web infrastructure in Finland in relation to major international developments and phases, where ontologies, the silver bullet of the semantic web, were first in focus. After that, ideas of linked data publishing took off, and during the last 10 years, ontologies and linked data have been studied together as knowledge graphs in various domain-specific application settings. We are now entering the time of AI and neurosymbolic intelligent systems. The work in Finland has followed exactly the same pattern, with major projects such as FinOnto for ontologies, Linked Data Finland for linked open data, and various Sampo projects on knowledge graphs. Also, first steps towards knowledge discovery and AI have been taken. All work has been based on standards and best practices of W3C and others illustrated at the bottom. We have learned that it really makes sense to develop a linked open data infrastructure together with the stakeholders such as data owners. After each step, the infra from the previous steps can be reused in new applications and be developed further. Linked open data infra is also very resilient for different application domains, as illustrated by the Sampo series of specific systems. We have also learned that it's very important to make application development easy in order to keep the funders and the end users happy. For this purpose, we developed the Sampo UI framework. The idea there is to reuse a kind of standard interface model and logic. This means that the model and the systems are easy to learn by users and easy to be used by developers. The idea is to base application on a simple linked data service API, the Sparkle. The software is openly available in GitHub and it has been used by various groups in addition to us. The Sampo model and portals aim at making a paradigm change in publishing and using cultural heritage content on the web. The contents are published as linked data and also integrated seamlessly with intelligent tools for data analysis. In our vision, artificial intelligence should help the user in solving research problems and also in finding new ones using creative AI methods. In Douglas Adams' novel, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the computer was asked, "What is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything?" The answer, 42, may be right, but it would be nice to know also why. This illustrates that explainable AI is needed for humanities research, and I think that symbolic linked open data is one way to go. Thank you for listening. More information about the work presented can be found on the home pages of the Semantic Computing Research Group. Okay, thank you very much. And all the software and data are available openly as by CC by 4 license. So if somebody's interested in trying out the systems or tools we have been developing, and also the data is available openly. We only deal with open data. We don't like closed data.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Eero. So now we have up to half an hour of Q&A. So the panel, the Q&A panel is already open, so there's a few questions there. If you would like to ask the question verbally, please raise your hand and I can enable your camera to be turned on and your microphone. Just keep in mind that this presentation is being recorded, so you will allow us to share that observation. Otherwise, put it in the Q&A. So, team, you probably already noticed there's some questions already in the panel. So perhaps the first one we can start with this question already flagged it up as that you can answer verbally. So as a very broad question for team, how do we change the mindset of institutions to be more open and accepting of feedback about the issues within their systems and metadata? Having worked in big museums, I sense there is a tendency to see feedback as criticism and a problem. My own thoughts on this is that it is because they see putting their collections and collection metadata online as the end game, but need to have some way of thinking that the stories and discoveries and interactions that you gave examples of are actually the product. So yeah, if you are happy to expand on that, please.
Very good. No, thank you, James. Oh, early ones are good. Yeah, I think and I'll tell a small story of an institution that I reached out to in the UK when we came on board with this project. And again, as I've described in some of the chats, we're just metadata, and we're only ever accessing publicly accessible metadata, nothing behind a paywall or a login. We don't touch that. I reached out to this institution, and they explained the process, explained what we did. We had the site up and running at the time, and they said, why would people use your website? They come to our website, which I think speaks to some of what you said, James, around the product. And I said, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. And I said, well, you've got about several thousand items of Fiji, because I use Fiji as my go-to proxy for finding things that institutions have. It's publicly accessible on your website. I'd love to be able to show it through our site, which is designed, as I gave in my talk, for low bandwidth environments. And I said, if people find it on our site, they will get directed to yours to see the source and all of the richness around which you provide it. And they said, okay, you can do that, but you can only access the stuff which we have physically on display. And I went, how do I know that? They said, there's a little option on our site where you tick it and it says on display. So I ticked that, and we went from several thousand items of Fiji to about 3. And I think it speaks to what you described, James, that it's about a product, and our job is done once we put it up online. And I think all of that, the examples of metadata that's wrong, I guess people don't like to be challenged, but I think that's that phrase of you've got to be okay to sit in the fire, because actually, if you don't want to be challenged or ask questions about A, why do you have this? And B, you've got it and it's incorrectly labeled, or that's not what it is, it's this. And if you're not open to having those conversations, then you're probably better, if I'm being really blunt, to not make it accessible, just to be preserving. And I think the other bit, and sorry, your questions disappeared, James, off the screen here, but I liked how you described it as a product. I'm really fascinated because all those examples I gave, my personal one, finding a record that had been buried in an archive, I told that story to the ABC team, and I hadn't pre-warned them that I was going to tell that story. There were audible gasps in the Zoom call when I told that story. Because again, and one of their leads came back to me and said, we've never seen ourselves as archivists or librarians, but your story made us realize that we are preserving the heritage of the Pacific for a future. And I think if you don't lean into that, the impact of that, we try to talk about that a lot at the library, that what is the impact of what you're doing? So if the impact of what you're doing is only, Google hits on your site, that's a pretty low level. I've always been fascinated. It's hard to tell the impact, because actually what I'm fascinated by is if a young person sees something on our site and then presents it to, their granny, and like I can send the link later on of our promo video, which basically captures this. What I'm fascinated in is what are all the stories and the relationships and the intergenerational things that happen, because elders are seeing things and photos of what life was like in Tokelau in 1940, and they're telling their children and their grandchildren who are now living in, Liverpool or in Paris. These young people will never get back to Tokelau. Tokelau is going to be underwater in the next 100 years. But if they don't even know that this experience existed, and that and the impact of, if you make it accessible, you allow people to tell their own stories and bind together, that's an incredibly rich opportunity. And yes, you might be challenged, and yes, you might be called out on some things, but those are going to be outliers. Pacific people, by and large, are just in awe. And I've been in these rooms with people at our institution where you can see tears because they're seeing photos of themselves as children, which they don't even know we had. You have to lean into the impact of what you do. Otherwise, it's just keep the stuff in the box. I don't know if that answers your question, James, but that's kind of where my head goes when I hear that. You can't do this.
Also, for example, I have a question for both of the speakers. So, for example, we have an issue as well with text as a colonial imposition, and where usually text favors a particular type of documentation, a particular type of knowledge. So, Tim, on one hand, within your framework and within your spaces where you work, how do you address this issue of dealing with oral history and intangible heritage for documentation? And for Eero as well, how is the current technology that we're using over-favoring this type of textual for AI, where we are pretty much ignoring all the other type of cultures and knowledges? So yeah, open question for both of us, for both of you.
Well, we started with collection data, metadata, because it's sort of already human curated. But nowadays we are working more and more on text. For example, we published with the Parliament of Finland all the million speeches of the parliamentarians. And if you want to dig out into the data, for example, in this kind of data, then you have to extract mentions of people, entities in the knowledge graphs and so on. Or the biography sample that was illustrated in my presentation, where most of the data comes actually from text. And you have to do then knowledge extraction from unstructured texts. So texts are more difficult, but of course very important part of the culture. And I would say that most of the stuff is in textual form, like newspapers and so on. If you think it in the large. But AI is as we know, all these chat GPT things and things that are now happening, they are actually now very much happening on the textual side of knowledge, and that's a very interesting sort of topic in the coming years.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting one there, because many indigenous cultures are oral and based in that. I think there's an interesting bias in the fact that all of our records for the last 400 years are based on words, and there's this presupposition that before that, because we don't have a way to measure it or evaluate it, because we can't see it and hold it, it has less value, or it's less intangible, like you said, Javier. I'm fascinated and I've just started typing an answer to, sorry, apologies, I'm getting your name incorrectly pronounced, but Tahi, around examples of knowledge structures that are something other than the Western way. And I think these are aligned. I'm fascinated, we've talked about it a lot in our project, that Pacific cultures are lived cultures. And I gave that example of, if you have a tanoa bowl that just sits on the shelf like we do, and you never use it to actually make kava, you've actually denied the essence of what the thing's for. I think, in terms of knowledge structures, I'm not sure if it's exactly the same, but, indigenous cultures live in carving, they live in dance, they live in textiles, they live in weaving, they live in performance, they live in food, they live in, navigation. If you've ever seen the Micronesian stick charts, they're the most beautiful thing. That I love them. And I think what I love about them is they mess with our heads, because you see them and you go, oh, it's like a map. And our head is like Google Maps or a National Geographic map. But actually, if you understand what a Google stick chart, a Micronesian stick chart is, it's a representation of patterns and wave patterns and tides and atolls. It's essentially a representation of knowledge. But the key thing is, the navigators it was used to basically instruct and pass on knowledge. If you've ever seen them, really delicate, but it was never taken with them on the waka. And in our model of a map, you go, well, I've got this thing, so I've got to drive from here to there, so I need to have this thing. Pacific people and the Micronesian, again, I'm using it badly, but the navigators of the North sailed the greatest ocean on the planet for hundreds of years by just paying attention to what was in front of them. And so in a weird way, I think there's a tension there because we value the Micronesian stick charts. There's incredible knowledge and beautiful art, for lack of a better phrase. But actually in reality, they were a representation of knowledge that was used to pass down. When Pacific people were navigating and making their way through across the ocean, they had to be looking up, you know, and they had to be paying attention to everything that was going around them. That was their knowledge. And yet, so our artifact of that knowledge is the Micronesian stick charts. But even in that artifact, it wasn't actually how we used it. And so I think that, you know, the simplest way of describing that is, you know, our institutions have shelves and use shelves to store knowledge. How much of Pacific and Indigenous culture and knowledge can't fit on a shelf? That's the bit I'm interested in representing.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, and I think that's why also, I mean, curve principles and indigenous rights, they focus on beyond human systems. So yeah, so centering beyond the human and identifying these other narratives that feed to the knowledge of the culture. But Gabriela, I'm gonna ask you to unmute if you would like to ask your question verbally, and then I'll come back to the Q&A.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fabulous. Thank you both for your talks. They were very interesting. The question that I've formulated so far is aimed at Tim. So towards the end of your presentation, you said something along the lines of it's one thing to know what's missing and another not to not know. I'm a South American PhD student working on Latin American collections held by the University of Aberdeen, which is quite a large collection within Scotland as a whole. It's the third largest. They've not really been worked on before, except for some preliminary work done by my current supervisors. And none of us know when they were actually reviewed. One of my supervisors is actually head of museums and special collections. Given the lack of digitization of these collections and the complexity of the systems that we have for both searching collections and archives, we're fairly certain that the communities of origin are probably unaware about how much we hold. So part of my aims include making at least what I work on during my thesis digitally available to the communities of origin. But I will likely encounter similar issues of digital inaccessibility, as you mentioned, for the Pacific in terms of low or expensive data, for example, costs for accessing via your phone and whatnot. So I was wondering if there was any tips or any kind of approach that you could point me towards that would be something that I could do that's sustainable within, for example, my PhD project for the moment. Thank you.
You still mute, Tim.
In my world, that means I have to take a drink. No, it isn't. I've only got water, I promise, even though it's 9:30 at night. I think there's an interesting one there, and it's come through in a couple other ones around what's expensive and how we've been really clear that for Pacific communities, they can't follow the leads of the national libraries or national museums. They can't buy big ex libris or these big infrastructures. So a lot of our, and I'm struck, and it's a little bit for the other question, I'm fascinated. Preservation has this whole, well, you've got to scan at high res, it's got to be TIFF, it's got to be other standard. You know, having been in the Pacific, they have scanners, but they're Epson scanners. They're A4 scanners that you can buy from B&Q or you know, a Curry's. That's what they're scanning with. I think there's an element where people will do what they can with what they have in terms of where you then put it or host it in a repository. There's things like Omeka, there's Mokutu, there's a number of low open source ones. Open source comes with a bit of complexity because you've got to manage a bunch of stuff. I'm working currently with the Solomon Islands National Museum using a very lo-fi Omeka instance, omeka.a.net, Omeka. And that's, it's just a start. And I think it's sort of said, you know, someone else, I'm not sure it's Nicholas or someone or Tabitha, there is a start where you can just give it a go. Again, and I think this is part of the challenge is there's preservation and all of that it holds, and then there's access. And I think often in our institutions, we sometimes try to smush the two, or we say you've got a big funding for preservation and it's, you know, multiple copies and everything else, and then we build a whole bunch of access. I think for most indigenous and small communities, none of that's accessible. So they kind of can lean into an access layer. So a lot of our providers, for example, use YouTube. You know, it's an open platform. With an iPhone, you can tell a story, you can record some stuff, and you can upload it. In a similar way, and I know it's the big ugly word that probably most won't use, but Pacific communities are recording and telling stories and sharing stuff in, you know, in Facebook. And I know no one really wants to talk about it, but that's where a whole bunch of conversations happening. I think to your point around having a, you know, sharing maybe what you're capturing. I mean, if you were, I'll be really honest, if you had essentially for us, and again, Digital Pacific, if it's a stable site which has metadata and records put on it, we can harvest it. You know, we can web scrape it. Doesn't need an API. There are simple ways of putting stuff online. So even things which were, to your point, you know, a WordPress setup of your story, if you're making that stuff visible to people and then saying, hey, here's where it's held, come and be in a relationship with us, that's a huge step, you know. And again, that idea, that metaphor of, you know, bridges between worlds, it doesn't have to be our Digital Pacific bridge. There are multiple bridges you could build between worlds, and a, you know, a Teams call or a Zoom call can work as much. Taking an iPhone and doing a live stream, walking around your collections and saying, hey, here's this. That's a huge bridge too, you know. Yeah, I'd lean into finding the ways and using some of the platforms that other people are doing. Perfect's the enemy of good, so you don't have to be perfect. I remember someone said to me once, they said, but what if we get it wrong? And I think this is sort of the commentary from Tabitha, and in a New Zealand experience, I said, what, you mean wronger than the last 140 years where we mislabeled a thing and stuck it in a box? I work at the National Library of New Zealand, and we held He Tohu, which is the treaty, the Declaration of Independence and the suffrage petition. The Treaty of Waitangi was only put on public display in 1991. Before that, it was just in a box. It's the founding document of this nation. Well, actually, the second founding document. Te Heke Putanga is the founding with the Declaration of Independence. It's torn apart because for, you know, over 100 years, it was left in boxes and basements. Let's not kid ourselves that we've done a good job at looking after stuff. And don't be afraid of making mistakes. And that's the point about sitting in the fire. People will call you out. But hey, it's hard not, you know, we've been wrong for a long time. We just haven't made it visible and accessible.
Thank you. We also have another question from Tari. So for Eero, so she was wondering if you can expand on this intersection of artificial intelligence and the open data, and if you have any examples or your experience on feeding knowledge graphs to large language models. I mean, because she was thinking of using the Sampo project as a case study. So I was wondering, well, we were wondering if you can expand a little bit more on knowledge graphs and large language models.
Yes, okay. We will be using large language models for analyzing Finnish texts, and there are different levels that you can do there for recognizing entities like historical places and people, and even do the morphology. We actually use FinBERT, which is an extended version of Google BERT language model for Finnish language. These international sort of language models can be sort of geared towards the particular application domains or even different languages, like in our case, from English to Finnish. Then for extracting sort of topical descriptions, we extract keywords that are available in our ontology infrastructure. So we have tens of thousands of ontological concepts extracted from theory that museums and other cultural heritage organizations have been using for tens of years in Finland, and there we use a system called ANNIF, which is a machine learning based system for identifying the keywords and how many keywords, for example, should be identified and so on. And then the next layer is actually sort of kind of topical detection. So, for example, in the law Sampo system for Finnish legislation, we are integrating, for example, Finnish legislation, Estonian legislation, and European legislation. And one of the ideas that we are experimenting there is to sort of map different laws or statutes onto different problems that people encounter in their life. And using this kind of classification of common life problems like getting a divorce or something like that, then you can automatically find legislation that is sort of related to this kind of human problem area. And there we use Facebook FastTech, for example, which is also a kind of AI model based on language. And then on the knowledge graph side, what we have been doing kind of AI thing is finding. As we know, when you're dealing with museum collections, you usually try to find entities like certain artifacts from the collections or people there. But what we are doing here, in addition to that, is to find interesting semantic relations between different things. So you can ask questions like formulate questions like, how are Finnish artists related to Italy? And then, because we have this huge knowledge graph there, then the system can automatically try to find different kind of paths between Finnish artists and different places in Italy, for example. Like topic of a painting is in Rome, which is in Italy, for example. And based on this kind of paths, it's possible to also create this explanation that I referred to in my presentation. So we can not only find these relations, but also explain to the end user why is this particular person related, for example, to Firenze, or so on. So that's very interesting, and we have done that also in an international setting. In EU, we had a project on where we combined biography collections from Finland, Netherlands, and Austria, and Slovenia. And the idea was to try to find the different kinds of international connections between persons, for example, and collections there. So there are lots of interesting stuff. Now what we are working on, and probably Terhi is thinking something along this line, is that since we have now this kind of very, very large sort of database-based knowledge graphs, how can we sort of leverage on the large language models? How can we combine them in order to make something interesting? And what we are now doing, but haven't yet published or done any results yet, is that we have systems like Opera Sampo, which has lots of information about opera performances, but it's all metadata. There's no text basically there. And now what we are trying is that we can generate from this kind of databases, structured metadatabases, information to large language models. And then we try that if we, for example, put data generated from Opera Sampo knowledge graph into Llama, a large language model that was published recently by Facebook, can you then start discussing about the operas, historical operas in Finland with a large language model? So that's very interesting whether we can really sort of combine these two approaches and reuse the structured data in the sort of large language models and vice versa, the large language models for creating knowledge graphs. That's interesting stuff. And it will be a hot topic for the coming years in universities.
Thank you, Eero. So next, I'm going to combine two questions from Nicholas. So the first one is there a roadmap for small organizations to follow towards this model of data availability? And also, is making data available in this way expensive for small organizations with archives or collections which may be suitable for this approach? Consider the cost first and very often say no. So it's difficult to implement. So a question for both of you. Is there a roadmap or perhaps a suggestion how to start, and what are the cost cross benefits for this type of implementations? So any observations perhaps from both of you?
Well, if I start, for our case, actually, this is very much in the heart of what we are doing in the infrastructure, because we have more museums in Finland per capita than any other place on the globe. But of course, most of the museums are very small. They don't have any sort of IT personnel there. And the idea there is exactly that by providing this kind of national services for ontologies and cataloging, then and also publishing, then it makes really all this stuff possible for smaller units to join. So that's a very good sort of business question. And now actually in Europe, they also realized this in this new ECCCC. It's initiative that started a year ago or so, where one of the main concerns of the European Union was exactly that we have these stronghold museums like Louvre and others, but then most of the museums are very small, and they really cannot sort of leverage or use this new technology. And one of these EU project major goals is actually to support and sort of distribute the solutions that have been created by bigger organizations and universities to be reused then by smaller sort of units.
Tim, what's your experience from this?
Yeah, I think and again, coming from sort of the practical experience of visiting the Pacific and engaging, as I said, it sounds like, I'm just looking at some of Tabitha's comments as well, that there are obviously similarities between small and low-funded institutions across the world. It doesn't matter geographically where you are. You might be the curator, you're also the social media person, you're also the person that does, looks after the front desk and empties the rubbish bins. But I think there's been some really interesting conversations with Pacific partners, because they recognize that they can't be like institutions in the West. And so they are doing quite simple things. Like I said, Omeka, some of these small, more web-based cataloging systems are coming into play, where essentially they're cloud hosted and you pay a subscription, and then you're adding your content, maybe uploading or adding metadata, but maybe uploading a PDF or an image taken with a phone. I think, to your point that was raised around time, that comes with a time. I think the reality is, and as Tabitha said, you're the single person in the museum who's looking after that. The actual reality in the Pacific is that on the great list of priorities that governments are facing and state institutions are facing, preserving and protecting metadata is pretty low down on the list. There's biosecurity, there's climate change, there's food, there's weather, there's a whole range of things that feature more highly. I think into that space. But on the flip side, I'm also struck and thinking about this quite a lot more, that in indigenous cultures, the preservation is in the practice. And this is where I think there's a clash between preservation as per what we would see, libraries and archives where we store things in temperature controlled environments, and text-based. In a Pacific culture and indigenous cultures, the preservation of language, the preservation of performance, the preservation of weaving, the preservation of all these things is in the practice of it. And so in a weird way, the outcome of it, the recording of the performance or the recording of the photo of the woven basket, is in which metadata is often generated, because anything with an iPhone comes with a whole bunch of metadata, it's almost the flip. Because it's actually the preservation and the handing down of the knowledge comes from the practicing of it. And I think that's a really fascinating one to think, because then actually all you need to preserve in a sort of storytelling way is either in words or in audiovisual or in image. You're almost preserving the outcome. And I think that's a really interesting one, because most of our systems are designed around, we're preserving and protecting all this written and objects and image content, so that in the future knowledge can continue to be facilitated. And it's hard to write down a dance, and yet a dance might tell a story of the history of a village or a community. What is that environment? I think is a really interesting one, because actually, if you want to empower Indigenous communities to hold and tell their own stories, maybe our Western way of organizing and holding it all doesn't make any sense anymore. And in a world, particularly in the Pacific, where energy's at a premium, how can you digitize if you can't keep energy turned on? You can store it on a hard drive and no one can see it. That's good preservation. But the reality in the Pacific is energy's at the premium. And I'm fascinated, to your point, around AI, the compute power and the cloud power to literally keep all that stuff doesn't exist in the Pacific and won't. So I appreciate what it is, but we can't afford it. You know, we can't afford, they can't afford to do what we're doing. We can barely afford to do what we're doing, particularly as it's arguably burning down the planet, depending on where your energy source is for all of your models.
Yeah, one interesting thing is actually that what is the smallest museum? It's individual citizens, and this aspect of citizen science is very important. And this there are interesting initiatives. For example, we are collaborating with the British Museum at the moment and dealing with their data that has been collected in archaeology of coin finds, for example, metal detecting community, and they don't have, of course, any ways of reporting and how to collect then this data from individual citizens, and it's a very valuable collection. They have, for example, 1.6 million different finds found in England and Wales. And this is very valuable information that they are maintaining, but they are actually helping then the citizens. They have a network of officers around England and Wales that where people who find something can come and then record the data that they have, or the artifacts that they have found by metal detecting devices. So, and there are also other examples of citizen science, and this is like I think that maybe in Pacific as well, something like that could be organized so that it could be collected, the heritage from the islands. Somebody just had to do it, yeah. Like in Finland, the Sampo actually is also an example of it originates from the Finnish epic Kalevala and the folklore that tells about these Sampos in the past. They were actually collected from the rural areas of Finland by students and other researchers who were traveling there and asking people about their sort of heritage. That's also this kind of folklore collection is an example of this kind of, if not citizen science, something related to that.
Absolutely, and I think that's where, in terms of in a world where energy is at a premium and maybe sort of our ways of connecting at a premium, or broken down, it'll be the oral traditions that pass on knowledge, and that's not bound to the Pacific. We have humans have passed on their stories with words for thousands of years. They're what bind our beliefs. They're what bind us as people. And I love how, in a weird way, it loops back to that. It will always loop back to storytelling and how we pass that on, and the knowledge. The songs, the dances, the performances are the bits that bind us and the bits that protect us. I think there's a fascinating piece of, and I tell this example of one of my cousins who was in Fiji said, they're actually in San Francisco, but I was talking to them about the project, and they said, oh, you should connect with this person because they do these incredible Fijian recipes, and would be it's a real cultural way of preparing food. And I said, that'd be great. Who, can you send me the details? And they literally paused mid-sentence and went, actually, no. Actually, now I think about it, they don't do it as well as they could, so don't talk to them. And I think there's a fascinating conceit in how we as humans interact. And I think the food example is great because, if you gather together, there'll be a way of preparing a dish that, your mother does, and then the auntie does, and then your great-grandmother does. And no one ever wants to tell anyone which is the right way of doing that dish. So we end up with 4 of the same dishes at Christmas. But it's still wonderful and we still connect, And so I love that idea of how we continue to pass on our stories in ways that are rich, enduring, continue to evolve and develop, whilst they still have similarities and constructs that enable us to make sense. And I think that's a really powerful and important thing.
Perfect. Yeah, yet another super amazing webinar.